Okay, we've got this section in the spec that has sort of been functioning as a dumping ground for things that we needed to codify that we don't want to be in the main spec, and there isn't really one rationale that has governed why things ended up there. It's kind of been a grab bag of different rationales. What it actually says in the intro to Annex B is that everything in Annex B is actually required when the host is a web browser, except for, with the exception of XS, all of the other JavaScript engines are primarily engineered to target the web browser. So a lot of Annex B remains implemented on Node, even though Node is not a web browser, simply because it uses the V8 engine, which was engineered primarily for the browser. Outside the browser, everything here is normative but optional, which has had two historic interpretations. What I always took normative but optional to mean, including, I believe, in the negotiations that arrived at the phrasing, what I meant by it during those negotiations, is that each element individually is normative but optional, meaning that you don't need to implement it in order to be correct, but if you do implement it, you must implement it this way. Alan Wersbrock, I think, at one point, I'm not sure if still, took the normative but optional to mean that it applies to Annex B as a whole, that you either don't implement everything in Annex B, or if you implement anything, then you implement everything in Annex B as stated. I certainly don't subscribe to that and would never have. I think this is one of these cases where we arrived at consensus on words because we didn't realize that we had not arrived at consensus on meaning. Everything, when I talk about it being a garbage dump, in the absence of legacy usage, everything in Annex B would be removed from the specification. I think that is accurate. It's acknowledging the reality that everything here, the reason we codify them in Annex B is because web browsers must support them. That's accurate. Notice in the last paragraph, there's a not normative in the spec sense of normative, but normative in the natural language sense of normative. A recommendation, programmers should not assume the existence of these features and behaviors when writing new ECMAScript code. ECMAScript implementations are discouraged from implementing these features unless the implementation is part of a web browser or required to run the same legacy ECMAScript code that web browsers encounter. I think that is a very nice set of distinctions to have in that last paragraph, that we actually discourage these features from being used or implemented when they're realistically something we can consider not to be part of the language. But now let's go through the actual contents of Annex B and make some distinctions. So I want to use this Venn diagram to motivate the categories we should place the different elements of Annex B into. The outer thing is ECMAScript as a whole, including both strict and sloppy, including Annex B and the main spec. And Annex B itself, I'm dividing it up into two portions, Annex B safe and Annex B unsafe. Unsafe are, well, safe would be something like string.prototype.bold, just a little utility that's up on string.prototype to make HTML text out of data. An example of something unsafe is regexp.$1, which is a global communications channel. It's a non-local form of communication. It simply reflects data from whatever the most recent match is of a regex instance in that realm against some string. There's stuff that's just perfectly safe from, from a non-locality of causality or from a side effect perspective or any of those. And then with this underlying Venn diagram in mind, I'm going to make some recommendations about which things should stay in Annex B, the orange on the right, and which things I think we should go ahead and mandate as part of the de jure spec, promote them into the main spec, because even if we would like to discourage programmers from using the features, we cannot realistically discourage implementers from implementing them. And if they're universally implemented, realistically, we're not going to succeed at discouraging programmers from using them. So this is an inventory of the elements of Annex B. Let's start with the upper left corner. The things which apply both to strict and non-strict code, and to sloppy code, i.e. they're not specific to sloppy code. Escape and unescape, I believe, are universally implemented. Anybody please correct me if I'm wrong. And the XS guys, both of which are here, I see a nodding head. For all of these, I have no question that the browsers implement all of them, and in fact, Annex B requires them. So XS is actually the only free variable here. Underbar, proto, or dunder proto as we like to call it. I was surprised to find both the accessor property and the special string literal syntax were both in Annex B. I think having variable syntax where systems that implement Annex B parse according to one syntax and systems that don't parse according to another syntax, I think that is a tolerable situation when the difference is guaranteed to either mean the same thing on both or reliably cause a failure on one. To have it succeed at parsing on both but mean different things, I think is a disaster, because then the same snippet of code moved from one to the other will silently assume a different meaning. The dunder proto object literal syntax is a nice simple example of that. In a system where that syntax is not recognized, it would actually use defined property semantics to create a property with that name that has no special status and does not override the prototype. And that's, and I'm hoping nobody actually does that. Dunder proto, we put it into Annex B at the time that we accepted mutable prototype chains into the de jure language. And the hope might have been that some environments might not provide for mutability of the prototype chain by omitting dunder proto, but we did not make reflect.setPrototype optional. So without making reflect.setPrototype optional, there's no fundamental ugly semantics that a system gets to avoid having by omitting dunder proto. So I think dunder proto is effectively universal, likewise with define getter, define setter, lookup getter, lookup setter. All of those things I believe are universal, and they're easily, their semantics is easily defined as a slight convenience over defined property. There are actually some buggy implementations of the define getter, setter, lookup getter, setter things on some browsers, but this is an example of why codifying it is codifying it in a more mandatory fashion would make it less likely for these bugs to have gone unnoticed for so long, unnoticed and unfixed for so long. The string.prototype additional methods there are substring, which is essentially another way to say slice. There's trim left and trim right, and then there's a whole bunch of HTML things, including, if I recall, blink. If somebody wants to keep blink in Annex B while promoting the rest of it, I wouldn't mind. On date, there's get year and set year, both of which are 2-digit years rather than 4-digit years, if I recall. So there was a Y2K problem with them. I think that was the issue. But in any case, they're universal, likewise 2GMT string. That's the magic non-local regex properties that I mentioned. Regex prototype compile is an odd beast. Last time I looked at it, it seemed like it actually violated the semantics of object.freeze in terms of what it would do to a regex if you did it after the regex was frozen, but I have not looked at that for a long time. But in any case, it's completely, I'm perfectly happy to let that stay in Annex B. The unsafe things are the regex statics, as I mentioned, and then in the upcoming error stack proposal, the stack accessor property on error.prototype should be codified. It's not currently codified. It should be codified. It's proposed to be codified as part of that proposal, but the way of access, and that proposal proposes 2 different ways to access the stacks. The one that's from the inside is not able to be made safe, and by putting in Annex B, you enable it to be omitted. We also mandate that it be deletable. This is another important idea, which is everything that we're putting in Annex B so that it can be omitted. We should also mandate that if it is present, it be deletable, so that a startup script in a given environment where they're present can delete them and then have the resulting state be a state that itself conforms to a pristine ECMAScript spec. Document all is a horror that exists for one particular purpose, and Annex B text makes it very clear it should never be reproduced ever, anywhere. And by the way, for people who don't know what some of these oddball cases are, in a way that's kind of the point of the things that remain in Annex B, is these are oddball cases that we really want to be as ignorable as possible, but we still want to codify them so we all agree on them when they're present. And then the for var x equals y in, i.e. For in where the declaration includes an initializer is completely meaningless and useless, but it is, I think it's accepted as part of the normal syntax. I don't think it was a sloppy only.
It was.
It is sloppy only?
Yeah.
Okay. In that case, I'm much happier. And also, I read the text and I could not understand what the text was saying about var declarations inside catch blocks. Yes?
I have a microphone for this. So the thing about var declarations in catch blocks is that normally you cannot have a lexical declaration that conflicts with a inner var declaration. Patch bindings are lexical declarations, but they predate that rule existing because they predate let being in the language. And so that syntax that you have on your slide, the catch X with var X inside of it, was legal in ES5, and so it has to remain legal in ES6, even though.
And is that one sloppy only?
I don't think that one is.
Okay. So the var thing, I'm very happy that that's sloppy only. I would then move that into the lower mandate section, which is the things that are already sloppy only. Since it's syntax, my bias on syntax is to mandate syntax because however horrible the syntax is, having the syntax cause programs to parse differently in a way that does not cause a failure is a worse horror. But with both for and catch, if we did continue to let them stay in Annex B, both of those do cause reliable failure if they're not acceptable by the parser, so those aren't dangerous. Annex B also has mandated several pieces of syntax that are already specific to sloppy mode. And the question is, to my mind, quarantining them in sloppy mode is adequate. They don't need to be doubly quarantined by being both in sloppy and in Annex B. Any code that's avoiding sloppy mode in any environment that enforces that avoidance of sloppy mode is already not subject to those things. There's these things that we've never codified that are part of de facto standard JavaScript, which is sloppy caller, callee, and arguments. For a while, we had codified the strict poisoning of them to, in order to flush them out of the ecosystem. They got flushed out of the ecosystem to the point that we've been relaxing the poisoning. But as far as I know, everybody who implements sloppy mode continues to implement those. So I think they should be codified, but I think they should continue to be in Annex B. And now I want to bring attention to the greatest horror of them all, for which I'm going to make the most distasteful recommendation possible next to the status quo, which is HTML-like comments. Everybody in the room who has taken part in an effort to build an accurate JavaScript parser, please raise your hand. Okay. Now, for all of those people, I want you to keep your hands down on for the next question. For all the remaining people in the room, who believes that they understand precisely how the HTML-like comments parse in a parser that recognizes them?
Great. Does watching Leo show off your...
Yes, that counts. Okay, one person. Let the notes record. So HTML-like comments, they are not specific to sloppy. They lie at a different distinction, which is the distinction between program code and module code. Module code does not recognize them. And notice that this thing is the left angle, bang, hyphen, hyphen. That can be part of valid JavaScript text. You know, operand less than the not of the pre-decrement of something. Likewise, the post-decrement of something being greater than something. So the fact that this parses as HTML-like comments somewhere and is not recognized by parsers elsewhere means that you can write code that purposely means two different things depending on what the rules are of your parser. And it's not just your platform parser. It's also all of your tool parsers that do pre-processing and transpiling. At one point, when I was still at Google, the Caja project, we got a responsible disclosure filed against Caja. Somebody found a complete subversion of Caja, a full authority attack against Caja, because the Acorn parser that Caja was using to look at the text before we passed it on misunderstood what the parsing rule was for HTML-like comments, recognized them, but recognized them under slightly different parsing rules. And somebody was able to take advantage of that to do a full breach of the Caja system. And then having these things be in Annex B, where they currently are, makes it that much worse. Because then, even if you know that something is being parsed by an accurate script parser, not module parser, even when you know it's being parsed by an accurate script parser, since this is in Annex B, you don't know whether it'll be parsed or not, and therefore your tools don't know. And therefore, the only way for a tool to accept all of JavaScript, do some transpilation of it, and be safe is to try it both ways and generate the combinatorial explosion of that's exponential in the number of HTML-like comments. It's crazy making. Or I suppose it's actually not a combinatorial explosion because it either recognizes them everywhere or nowhere. Although that's not necessarily the case with Annex B. So my recommendation is that HTML-like comments be promoted to the main spec. Because even though they are horrible and I would love to kill them, there's few things in JavaScript I hate more than the complexity that comes from recognizing these things. Having them be recognized somewhere and not elsewhere is worse than having them be recognized consistently everywhere.